Hey guys, I'm James with Mill Cove Woodworks, and today I want to show you how to build this table. So this table measures 38 and 3/4 inches wide and 80 and a quarter inches long. And for the tabletop, I actually didn't record that process. To be honest, I did that months ago before I even ever kind of thought about doing YouTube and making these build videos. But the general idea is there are four boards, and this is 8/4 poplar. But there are four boards that make up this top, and I did some biscuit joint for the boards, more or less just to kind of help get that top level alignment that I wanted. Glued, clamped them up overnight, and then once it had dried, came back and the rough edges were cut to length to that 80 and a quarter inch that I have here. So there really wasn't anything special or noteworthy about the actual tabletop, but the table base is definitely a build that was worth filming.
The first set of cuts that I make are for the outside pieces of the legs. I want the height of the table to be 30 inches, so for these cuts, the total height needs to be 26.5 inches. I start by cutting down my stock to 28 inch, just to make sure I've got a little bit extra to work with. Once that's done, I rip 4-inch wide pieces and then add a 10-degree angle on the top and the bottom of each board. After all my cuts are made, I do one last check to ensure that all four boards match up and my angles are right. Next, I go back to my stock and I make cuts for what will be the top piece of my legs. My tabletop is 38 and 3/4 inches wide, so I make these 35 and 3/4 inches long so that they'll sit back 1.5 inches from each edge of the top. And once I rip them down to a matching 4-inch width, I add a beveled edge on each end. Now I can lay out the three pieces I've cut for each leg so that I can take the measurements for the two inside pieces. The bottom one will be 2 inches up from the ground, so I make a mark there and then take the inside measurements for that piece, and then take the measurements for the top piece that will fit inside the upper portion of the legs. And then once these have been ripped down to 4 inches, I can go over to the miter saw, cut them down to length, and make sure I've got the matching 10-degree angle cuts. With all the pieces cut, I can do a dry fit for the assembly just to ensure everything looks good. Clamping these angle pieces can be tricky, but I used some of my 10-degree offcuts and then flip them around, and that gives me a squared surface that I can use for the clamping. And I also use or cut two scrap pieces of wood that are 1/16 inches wide. I use these for placing underneath each end of the bottom piece to make sure that it's centered. And then once I'm happy everything fits together the way I want it, I take off the clamps so that I can actually start attaching each of the pieces. For the inside top piece, I use glue and exposed 3.5-inch screws since this surface will be covered up by the tabletop. I then glue and clamp the top of each of the outer leg pieces, again using the offcuts to give me a squared area to clamp with. And I'll leave these on overnight, and then I can come back tomorrow and reinforce this joint with screws. Next, I move on to the bottom inside piece of the leg assembly, and once I have it glued and clamped in place, I'm coming in here with some massive screws. These are 5-inch screws, which might seem like overkill, but I want to ensure this piece holds incredibly strong. So I start with a very small pilot bit, and then I come in with a 3/4 inch Forstner bit. Once that's done, I finish pre-drilling for the screws, and then I go ahead and run them into the boards. And once that's done, what I can do is come back and plug this hole with a 3/4 inch dowel, which gives it a nice finished look, and I actually think it adds a little bit of character to the piece. The next day, once the glue has set on this top portion, I go ahead and run the screws in, and I'm repeating the same steps from the lower assembly, only this time, rather than using those big 5-inch screws, I'm using 3.5-inch and a 3/8-inch dowel. And with the leg assembly now complete, I go ahead and work on sanding each of the pieces. And I start with 80 grit and I move my way up to 150. And during this process, I'm also adding the dowel plugs to the sides of the legs, cutting them flush, and then during the sanding process, this area will get cleaned up along with the rest of the pieces. And now the legs are done and they're ready for staining. And I tried several different colors, but I eventually landed on Early Americana by Varathane. I think it gives it a kind of a classic color that will be a good contrast with my floors. And I had heard that Poplar wasn't an easy wood to stain, but I didn't have any issues with overlapping or spots. Alright, so now we're ready to attach the top and the bottom stretchers that will connect the actual legs. For the top stretchers, these are also going to be used for attaching the tabletop. I cut them to 49 inches in length, and that'll give this base an overall length of 56 3/4 inches, and that'll give me just shy of a 12-inch overhang on each edge of the table. Attach these to the legs using pocket hole screws because these are just going to be covered up once I put the tabletop on. The bottom stretcher is cut to 51 1/4 inches long, and I'm using a pocket hole screw here on the bottom of this piece, mainly just to hold it in position because I don't have a clamp big enough to stretch the entire length of this table base. So once the pocket hole screw has been set and the piece is more or less in position, I can come back with a 3.5-inch screw, again using the same approach as before with the Forstner bit and the dowel plug, but this screw is really where the piece is going to get its strength from. The final cuts are for the angle braces that will attach to the bottom stretcher and the middle top stretcher. And these are really there just to ensure that there's no racking in the piece. Again, here I'm using the 4-inch wide boards and I'm cutting a 30-degree angle on each end. And again, attaching these was also tricky, but I was able to use some of the offcuts to help me hold this in place while I set the screws. And for the bottom, I'm attaching with the 3.5-inch screws, the dowel plug, same as before. And for the top, since this is going to be covered up by the tabletop, I'm just coming straight in from the top side of the stretcher with the screw exposed. And with that, the base is done, and I can move back to the previously assembled tabletop. And my first step here is to use some Starbond medium black glue to fill a few knots in the piece. And then I just spend some time sanding on it, working my way from 80 grit up to 150 grit. Then I raise the grain because I want to make sure that after I've applied the stain, that this piece still has a very smooth, polished feel to it. So once I've raised the grain, I hit it one more time with 180 grit, and the sanding is done, and now I can apply the stain. Once the stain is applied, the last step is to apply the finish. And for that, I'm using Varathane's water-based matte finish polyurethane. I've used this before, and I really like the matte finish versus a satin or semi-gloss, anything like that. I did 2 coats on the base and 4 coats on the top, which you might say is a little bit of overkill, but I want to make sure that this thing has as much protection as I could possibly give it. I mounted the top to the base using Z-clips. So I went in with my biscuit joiner and I added a slot about every 10 inches along the longer section, and then two slots at the shorter end. And then it was just a matter of marking my spots, pre-drilling, and attaching the clips. And these clips do have a tendency to move when you're screwing them in, so it can be a little tricky, and I made it harder on myself doing this from underneath the table. But eventually I was able to get them all done, and the tabletop was now secure. I started this base on a Saturday, first working out a plan for what size cuts I would need, and then putting together a more or less step-by-step process. For a project this size, I always feel like doing a little bit of extra planning in the beginning helps things go more smoothly. And I finished the build 8 days later on the following Sunday, so total build time was around 20 hours, give or take. But I feel like the finished product was exactly what I was hoping for, and I hope you found this video useful. Be sure to subscribe, give it a thumbs up, and we'll see you on the next build.